Hi, my name is Missy, and I am a gerontologist. A gerontologist is someone who studies aging. So actually the entire opposite end of the human lifespan from children, even though this video is directed at why you should vaccinate your children. But I think that my experiences working with older adults actually helps to show why you should vaccinate your children. And so a little background, gerontology in general can cover any part of the aging experience. You can do anything from policy to aspects of healthcare, transitions in living environment, mobility. There's a lot of different options. But for me, I specialize in Alzheimer's disease and various cognitive outcomes. I'm currently getting my PhD in cognitive neuroscience, where I focus on older adult cognition. While I was working on my master's degree in gerontology, I also worked full-time at 2 different assisted livings in their memory care units. And for those of you who haven't ever been in an assisted living or nursing home or memory care unit, and memory care unit is for people with dementia, usually people with Alzheimer's disease, but sometimes other dementias. And they usually have kind of moderate, so mid-stage to end-stage dementia. And I know, baby. And these people are usually needing a lot more care than somebody in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's disease. They are going to need help with most of their activities of daily living. So help getting dressed, navigating where to go, help with feeding, going to the restroom, with all matters of daily personal care. By this point, they're usually having trouble finding words, recognizing people. And so it's very round the clock care, and you find a lot of frustration in this population because they know that something's wrong, but their memory is damaged enough by that point that they don't know what is wrong. So most of the time they don't know that they have any type of memory impairment. They just know that they're confused and they're upset. And they know that something is unfamiliar and it can cause a lot of anger. And so my job, having, had a lot of training in older adult cognition, having a background in psychology as well as in arts, was that I was providing a lot of their day-to-day activities and lifestyle care that was meant to really improve upon their well-being and give them socialization that they weren't otherwise receiving. So I wasn't focusing on just their health care, though that was certainly a part of what I did, but I was focusing more on their well-being outcomes, so their psychological needs. A lot of what I did with my older adult residents was art therapy. It's very effective for improving mood, not just while you're doing art therapy with, this group of people in their 80s and 90s, but has outcomes for the rest of the day. Honestly, if you have a good art therapy session at 10:30 a.m., you can still have good results at 5 p.m. when they're eating dinner. Other things that I did was a lot of conversational needs, sometimes one-on-one, usually in groups because I would be with often groups up to 30 people. Another aspect of my job, though, was to really track their cognition long-term and their well-being long-term. This allowed me to communicate with nursing and hospice staff, administrative staff, and their families so that we could understand decline in their cognition, because there generally were not any improvements, it was only decline. And it's important to know what can they no longer do and what does that signify for their cognition, and how is that going to affect their health? So for me, doing, say, an art therapy project, if I noticed that somebody who used to be able to paint all the time could no longer paint, could no longer hold scissors, etc., that represented a major part of cognitive decline, and was probably going to affect other aspects of their life, and we would build that into their care plan. So I mentioned all of this to show what my background was, because that's going to matter. So most of my residents, the youngest of my residents I think I ever had was 68. The oldest was 104. So I had quite the range. Let's see, during the time I was working there, my 104-year-old would have been born in 1909. So it was stretching back quite a way. One of the things, though, is that even though the majority of my residents that I worked with had Alzheimer's disease, I still learned a great deal from them. A lot about their lives as children and young adults, because that's the part of their memory that's most intact. And generally with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, you lose the memory that's most recent. So they typically, couldn't remember maybe the most recent 10, 20, 30 years, but their childhoods, their teen years, their 20s was generally pretty sharp. And there are some different cognitive theories on why this is the case. There's definitely a memory bump during that time. And so this aspect of memory was preserved. And what I found is that a lot of my older adults could tell me a lot about what it was like to raise their children. So they could tell me about having their first children, having their first child, raising their families. But with that came the realization that a lot of them were having their children in the 30s, 40s, 50s, before the time of mass vaccination. And what I found was that though it was a lot of fun getting to hear about them talking about their children whom they love so much, a lot of them had lost children, far more than the amount of today, far more than my own grandparents who were born just a little bit after them. Definitely far more children lost for their generation than my own parents, and certainly more than my own generation. And a lot of this was due to communicable diseases, measles, polio, things that vaccinations just didn't exist for yet. And it was just a fact of life at that time that you would lose some of your children to these diseases. And it was very heartbreaking for them and for me as a listener to know that if they were having their children at this time, that wouldn't have been a problem. Most of them would not have lost those infants or children. And so that was one of the first times that I'd been able to actually hear firsthand the impact of not being able to have vaccines for your child, because I've lived in an era where I've always had access to vaccines, whether it was my mother making sure I was always vaccinated on time, or myself working in healthcare and health research, having to have vaccines in order to work at these facilities or at my university where I work, study, and teach. I've been very blessed to have these vaccines so that I've never had any of these communicable diseases. But this wasn't the case for my older adult residents. And so I would reflect on how that was very sad. But it didn't hit until later in my time of working with them, how much it also affected them personally. It was only after really understanding their health histories in conjunction with maybe behaviors that they would do daily that I understood how many of my residents had physical disability due to communicable diseases that are now preventable from vaccines. For instance, I had residents who had chronic pain and paralysis due to polio. I had one such resident who had polio as a teenager and permanent disability within a leg. It caused paralysis, difficulty walking. And what was sad was that by the time I worked with her, she couldn't remember having had polio. She remembered her childhood, but couldn't remember her late teen years. And so I didn't know at first that the pain she always spoke about in her leg, where she would beat and say, you know, this darn knee, and be literally crying from the pain. I didn't know it was from polio. And it wasn't until speaking to nursing staff and looking through her health records with her family that I was able to understand that that was the reason why. And it was tremendously impactful upon me to understand that this was something happening to several of my residents, that this chronic pain and disability that they were having as 80, 90-year-olds was caused from polio, something that I would never think about today, with, you know, polio only being in 3 or 4 countries now in the entire world, that this is still impacting people within my community and people that I work with professionally. Similarly, I had people with permanent eyesight problems, permanent hearing problems due to measles, scarring due to measles as well. And these are things that I just hadn't ever thought about. And the more that I reflect upon working with these amazing older adults, the more I realize how blessed I am to have access to vaccines that they never had access to when they were growing up. And also just how scary it is that so many people are disconnected from these older adults and from their experiences. The fact of the matter is that many people nowadays don't have access to a 93-year-old in their life who's a polio survivor. They don't have access to somebody who lost their child from measles and can tell you about the pain they went through. And because we are disconnected from the reality, we think that vaccinations are not as big of a deal as what they really are. We don't understand the true impact that they have for our own health, the health of our families, and the health of our communities as a whole. And so I'm making this video, one, to share my experience in the hopes that it raises some level of awareness of the people around me that this is still a very serious problem, especially now that the rates of vaccinations are declining in first world countries, and how this drop in vaccinations has a very real impact. The other reason I'm making this video is to encourage people to speak to their elders about public health issues. So not just about vaccines and the impact that vaccines have had on older adults' lives, but about other measures of public health and how much of an impact that makes. Other topics that I have found very helpful with talking to older adults about is changes in dental care and how much that has improved just in the past 40, 50 years. And how they are amazed that I am a grown woman nearing 30 who has never had a cavity due to good dental care, which is something that they did not have access to as children, and that even their children did not have access to. And so I really encourage you, find older adults in your community and talk to them about what healthcare was like when they were growing up, when their children were growing up, and what it's like now, and what they would like to see improved upon, because a lot of older adults do have complaints about the healthcare system that truly do need addressed. But also just ask them about what are technologies that are around today that weren't there when you were growing up, and how would it have impact your life? I think these are very valuable conversations that we can be having. And I think that if we have a better understanding of where we came from, and a better understanding of how public health has truly grown in the past century, that we will make better, more informed health decisions for ourselves and for our families. And so I encourage you to have these conversations with older adults, as well as if you have any questions for me, please let me know. But I hope that you found this interesting, and maybe I will talk to you guys later. Bye.